Hello, this is Christian Idealism, and today I want to answer, or at least address, a very important objection that I often hear in regards to the defeat condition. And so, if you watch my two previous videos, in the first video I explained what the defeat condition was, and then in the second video I draw kind of two main types of defeat and how they kind of play out. So in this video I want to address this objection. Comes in this is what it says. It says, Kyle, if we adopt this defeat condition, then it makes theism completely unfalsifiable. Because for any evil that we observe, we could just say, well, it's a defeatable evil. And so we can just invent some afterlife story to ensure that every creature that has ever existed will ensure that they defeat their suffering. Right? And so basically it's impossible on this model, this is the objection, it's impossible on this understanding for theism to ever be disproven by the existence of evil. So for any amount of suffering that we observe, theism just remains safe, right? So here's the thing with this objection. I actually sort of, in some respects, appreciate the objection because it does outline at least a limitation with Marilyn McCord Adams' view of how she viewed this. So how did Marilyn McCord Adams view this idea? Well, in her work, I think a lot of people some people at least, misunderstand her because here's the thing. She wasn't trying to present a theodicy or a reason as to why creatures go through horrific amounts of suffering, right? She wasn't trying to answer that question. In fact, she was very skeptical of that project. Rather, what she was mainly focused on was this idea of defeat into showing like, hey, here's a way in which we can retain God's goodness in light of the horrific suffering that we observe. And that if, as long as the suffering that people can go through is a defeatable suffering, right, then it remains a justified evil, right? So that's the important part to keep in mind, is that she's not actually providing a theodicy or a reason as to why people go through horrific suffering. All she's really doing is just showing how an evil could be overcome and how an evil can, at least in principle, be integrated into a larger good whole so that the creature who experienced that evil can come to see their life as on balance good. That's the important thing to keep in mind. Now, to the objection. I think the best way to answer this objection is to actually come up with an instance of an indefeasible evil. So here's a few considerations to keep in mind, which is that on this kind of framework, there is no such thing as an intrinsically indefeasible evil in the sense when we talk about evil as an event, okay? And the reason for this is very simple. Evil doesn't really get its defeasibility or indefeasibility on its own as just an event that exists. Okay? So that's the one thing we need to keep in mind, which is that if we just view evil as just as an event, we cannot say whether it is defeatable or undefeatable. Okay? In fact, we can't even really say that evil as an event actually has any relevance to the problem of evil whatsoever, because let's say we lived in a world where there's just quote unquote evil happening as events, but yet there's no creatures. Where's the problem? What's the problem of evil? Because in this instance, in this world, right, in this hypothetical scenario, you have evil as events that happen out there, but it doesn't actually affect any creatures. And so really, evil is only a problem for theism in its connection to a creature. Okay, simple enough, fair point. And so here's the thing, is that we can distinguish between two types of entities, right? So if we've established that evil by itself is not the problem, but rather evil in connection to a creature or an entity is the problem, then we can actually create a partition between two types of entities. So here's the first entity I want to talk about. This is an entity that I myself came up with, and I want to see what you guys think about it, okay? So here is an entity that I think would be a problem for theism. Let's call it an Allender entity. Okay. This Allender entity has three main characteristics. The first characteristic is this, that an Allender entity is purely motivated by evil intentions. Okay, so it's completely and utterly magnificent or whatever evil. You just call it evil, right? Its own mental states are just constantly wanting to cause pain and suffering to others. Okay, that's the first condition. The second condition is actually the most important one, which is that you actually have, let's say that this Allender entity, okay, has a requirement to cause evil on others in order to sustain its own existence. Well, what does that look like? Well, here's one candidate example. Pennywise from the Stephen King stories. Okay, I'm gonna try. Well, okay, I'll just spoil it for you guys. If you haven't watched it, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to spoil the movie for you. But basically, the idea is that you have this entity that feeds off the experiences of fear, that fear of children in this instance, right? That's why, in fact, that's why it's dressed up as a clown, is because clowns are the most common fear that children have, okay? And so this, Pennywise in this instance, in a sense, is kind of like the entity that I'm describing, right? It's an entity that literally feeds off of the negative experiences of others. It's not merely just an entity that feeds off the biology of entities, so it can't be just a parasite, right? Because that's what parasites are. A parasite just feeds off the biology of another entity. It doesn't actually feed off the negative experiences of an entity. What I'm talking about is an entity that specifically feeds off the experiences of others, in the sense that it feeds off their negative emotional or negative experiences, and when they feed off of it, it actually gets stronger. Okay, so that's the first kind of side of it, which is you have a creature that feeds off the negative experiences of other creatures, and as it does so, it actually itself gets stronger. Okay, so that's the first side. Then the second side of the equation, or the second side of the coin, we should say, is that if you take away the negative experiences of others, if you take away the suffering that it's causing, well, then it just ceases to exist, right? So basically, in this instance, you have a being which has to cause suffering in order to maintain its own existence, and if you try to stop it from causing suffering, then it basically gets weak to the point where it just doesn't exist or it can't do anything, right? So that's the second condition. That's the most important one, because in that instance, it is impossible for the entity to ever be redeemable. Like, by its own nature, it is required to cause suffering on others in order to maintain its own existence. And finally, here's the third condition, which is simply that, well, this entity is empirically verifiable, that there is a way you can, in principle, show how this entity has the other two characteristics. You can show that, hey, here's an entity that is not only is it evil, not only does it have evil intentions, but it also cannot exist without causing suffering in others. And so if you were to take this entity, let's say isolate it somewhere, then you could just say, well, this entity just happened to cease to exist, right? Because it cannot cause suffering on others anymore. And the moment that it stops causing suffering on others, it just completely dies, right? That's the kind of concept of what I'm talking about. And so with these three conditions, what it outlines is that even on a defeat-based paradigm of evil, you can actually show an instance of an indefeasible evil. But in this case, the indefeasible evil is not because of the event itself, but rather the event in connection to an entity. And so here's how the partition works. We have two types of evils. Evils that have their origin in an Allender entity, which is what I just described, and then evils that have their origins in an ordinary entity. Okay. So, for example, here's an ordinary entity. Let's say there's a hurricane that comes around and causes all destruction, and a bunch of people die. Right. Well, does the hurricane actually require for its own existence to cause suffering on others? No, it doesn't. Right? In fact, the suffering in this instance is just a side effect of what it already does. And so in this case, a hurricane is not an Allender entity, right? It's just an ordinary entity, right? That just so happens to, by its own side effects cause suffering, right? And so with this in mind, we can actually draw an important distinction between two types of evils. Evils that are caused by Allender entities, okay, which in my schema would be evils that are indefeasible, versus evils that come from ordinary entities, which is basically what we observe in our world. And so here's my response to the objection. You just need to find an Allender entity. That's it. All it takes is one, okay, not two, not three, just one. All you need to find is one Allender entity, and you will falsify theism. You will prove theism false. In fact, not only will you show that theism is false evidentially, but you will show logically that theism is false. It's a logical problem, okay? It's not just an evidential problem, okay, on my schema. It is a logical problem of evil if you were to find an Allender entity. And so here's my challenge to you atheists out there that keep making this objection. Find me an Allender entity, okay? So how do you do this? Well, if there's any evil that we observe, just try to make an argument or an abductive argument for why the evil that we observe actually connects to an Allender entity. If you can do that, then you can challenge my theism. You can falsify my type of theism. So that's my challenge to you guys, okay? For any, people that keep making this objection, which is this. Just find one Allender entity, and I will become an atheist. Today. I'm not joking when I say that. If you can find one Allender entity, or even anything that is close to it, empirically, then theism's false. And we're done. No more debates. I will take down all my videos. Yeah, in fact, that's my challenge to you. I will take down all of my videos, and I will publicly declare that I'm an atheist if somebody can find me an Allender entity. That's my challenge to you guys, to you atheists out there watching. Anyways, have a nice day.